They say love and war are opposites, that they could never walk hand in hand. But I found out, through skin worn by time and memory, that loving during war might be the purest, most desperate form of resistance. I was a nurse in the war. I saved lives every single day. But the most important life I ever protected wore a different uniform, spoke a different language, and belonged to the side I was taught to hate. And that changed everything I thought I knew about, right and wrong. Maybe you've carried a love that was never supposed to happen. Maybe, like me, you were taught to see the enemy only as the enemy, never realizing that behind those trenches were hearts just as human as yours and mine. I risked everything to save someone the world wanted dead. I turned my war story into a quiet, hidden secret. But today I choose to share this truth with you, because I know we all fight battles no one sees, and carry loves no one would ever accept. If you've ever felt the weight of loving someone you weren't allowed to love, or if you've held something in silence that your heart was begging to speak, then this story is yours too. What I lived through was never supposed to happen, but it did. It was wrong in the eyes of others, but it was the truest thing my soul ever knew. Listen to the end, because maybe, somewhere in my pain and scars, you'll find the healing you've been searching for. My name is Opal Nadine Rivers. I'm 89 years old. My bones are thin, my skin pale, like it carries winter around with it. And my eyes, well, they still hold a hint of the green that once caught the gaze of someone who should have never noticed me. I live alone in an old house in the heart of New Orleans, with curtains as heavy as the silences I've gathered over a lifetime. The air here smells like incense and memory. There's an altar in the living room, not to any particular saint. Just a quiet space for everything I couldn't put into words. Today I sat down in my purple velvet chair with lace gloves still on my hands. And before you think it's some attempt to look fancy, let me tell you, it's only because sometimes hiding your hands makes you feel less exposed, like maybe the past won't slip out through your fingertips. I was a nurse in the war. Not one of those picture-perfect ones, but the kind that learned to hold their chest tight to stop both the sobs and the bleeding. I served in North Africa, stitching broken men back together while the desert covered the dead before the sheets could. But this isn't just a war story. It's a story of silence, of something that should have never happened, and yet, it did. If you can, stay here with me. Breathe slow. Settle into this little corner of voice I've made for you. And if any part of this emotional story reminds you of something that never had a name, then maybe it was written for you too. Subscribe to the channel, sweetheart, like this video, and listen to me through to the end. Because what I have to tell you, no one else can. It was 1943 when my boots touched the scorching soil of Tunisia, and I swear, the ground trembled like it already knew it was about to swallow too much. In that very first step, I felt the heat rise through the soles of my shoes, almost as if it were trying to warn me that this wasn't just about fighting a war. There was something in the wind, blowing sand into my clothes, that whispered the real battlefield wasn't only bombs and trenches. It was the quiet, invisible choices that changed everything. I wasn't just Opal Nadine Rivers anymore, the skinny girl with the big eyes. I was now a nurse at war, with a small suitcase, a red cross on my arm, and a heart that had no idea yet what resistance really meant. The makeshift tent stood so close to the front lines that, those first nights, I clenched my teeth in my sleep, sure the sky was about to come crashing down on me at any second. The metallic smell of dried blood mixed with the scent of wet leather, hot dust, and fear. There were screams. There were always screams, even when no one's mouth was open. They clung to the canvas, to the blood-soaked cloth we wrung out, to the eyes of the soldiers who came, and sometimes didn't leave. A war story rarely begins with bravery. It begins with a stomach turned inside out, a body that never fully sleeps again, and a soul being stitched back together with every wound we learned to close. I remember a man who came in mangled, missing a leg, holding his own jaw in place like he could stop the terror from spilling out. I remember him because that night I realized I wasn't made of steel. I was only pretending, just to survive. He gripped my wrist tightly, trying to say something I couldn't understand. I tried to smile, tried to clean his face, tried anything that resembled humanity. But there was no humanity left, only endurance. Sometimes, in the rare pauses between patients, I'd stare out at the scorched horizon and wonder what the hell I was doing, so far from New Orleans, so far from my mother's house, so far from the sound of my father's piano before he disappeared from the world. But part of me couldn't go back, and it wasn't out of heroism. It was because I knew that if I returned, I'd never be able to bear the eyes of those I'd leave behind. Being a nurse wasn't just morphine and stitches. It was learning how to carry someone else's despair like it was your own. It was carrying pieces of people even after they were gone. That first week, I still saw myself as a stranger there, like I was just a temporary visitor inside someone else's nightmare. But the night the tent collapsed under the sound of bombs, and I woke up with sand in my eyes, and a soldier screaming my name like I was the last living thing on Earth, I understood. That war wasn't someone else's anymore. It was mine too. Life in the field was built on absence. There was no water, no time, no illusion of beauty. Fingernails cracked, hair stuck to sweat, ankles stayed bruised, always ready to run or fall. But I stayed, one day after the next, and after a while I stopped counting days. The only thing that marked time were the eyes. Every pair of eyes that met mine carried a question no one dared to speak. Most wanted to know if they were going to die. Others, if they'd be forgotten. I never had answers. I just held their hands like that was enough. But what truly marked me during that phase, when it was still too early to lose myself completely, was one particular pair of eyes. Eyes that followed me from a distance, almost always hiding in shadows. Eyes that didn't belong to my ward, but somehow always knew when I was alone. They were too bright to fully disappear. Green, like morning-soaked leaves. And no, they weren't American. I knew that. It wasn't just the color. It was the way he looked at me, like I was a word he didn't know how to translate. I saw him for the first time at the edge of the camp, between two trucks, carrying something heavy but staying out of sight. He wore the wrong uniform. Or at least, not ours. I didn't understand what he was doing there, but something inside me trembled. Maybe it was that same trembling ground beneath my feet when I first arrived. Maybe it was the instinct that no matter how hard I tried, there would never be enough distance between me and what was about to be born. I could have told someone, but I didn't. And it wasn't out of fear. It was a deep, ancient impulse to keep it for myself, like finding a flower in the middle of the desert and deciding not to tell anyone, so no one would crush it. It was the first secret I buried in that dry land. And like everything we bury, without a ritual, it began to grow on its own, from the inside, out of control. Back then, I still believed I could clearly tell right from wrong, that there were sides, that there was us and them. But war, this war story that cuts through your body like an old wind, takes care of erasing borders. An emotional story isn't just made of tears. It's made of confusion, of tiny betrayals to everything we were taught. And there, in the silence between screams, I betrayed something. Maybe logic, maybe my own certainty. He didn't say a word, I didn't say a word, but the ground knew. That same ground that trembled beneath my feet when I arrived, trembled again that night when his eyes met mine. And I understood, without a single word, that this would be my real war. Not the one that would wound me on the outside, but the one that would tear me open from within. It was one of those damp nights when the wind doesn't come to cool things down. It comes to shove the dust deep into your lungs. That's when he arrived. I was finishing up disinfecting the far left corner of the tent, the one where the mosquitoes seemed to have taken up permanent residence, when I saw 2 soldiers dragging in a strange body. He wasn't on the list. He wasn't in any report, not in the evac rotation. It was like he had risen straight from the earth, crushed, soaked, made of silence. And I, whose eyes had always been more curious than my hands, felt time slow the moment I saw him. He was bleeding from his side, uniform torn all the way to his hip, his eyes half closed like the whole world had blinded him. But it wasn't the wound that froze me. It was the uniform. It belonged to another army, the other side. That uniform wasn't one of ours. It didn't smell like ours. It had a different cut, a different color, a different memory. And yet, they left him there, as if he were one of us. Maybe by mistake. Maybe because that night, no one could tell who was who anymore. That's how war was by then. So confused that even the enemy could be saved by someone trained to fear him. I stepped closer. My hands didn't hesitate, but my heart did. I felt sweat slide down my spine, like I'd just committed a betrayal. I was a nurse, not a judge. My job was to save, even when my soul trembled with doubt. No one else seemed to notice. They were too busy putting out human fires with buckets of hope. He was placed on cot 7, a number that would later feel like a spell. 7. The number of everything that stayed unfinished. I cleaned the wound, checked his vitals, injected morphine. He didn't speak English, or maybe he pretended not to. But his eyes, oh, his eyes spoke. They told of loss, exile, a different kind of fear. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of being discovered alive. It was the kind of look that begged for silence. And maybe that's why, even without a name, I buried that face deep in my memory. Like a memory that hadn't happened yet. A secret that was already mine before it was ever revealed. As I cared for him, I noticed the way his hands gripped the sheet like he was searching for solid ground, not fabric. The way his chest rose and fell like he was trying to choke back the past. His uniform was wet, not just with blood but with seawater. Sand clung to his skin, mixed with salt, as if he'd come from far away, carrying a piece of another continent. And maybe he had. I started calling him August. I don't know why. Maybe because of the heat. Maybe because he seemed to carry the weight of a summer that never ended. He never corrected me. Never said a word. Just closed his eyes every time I whispered that name. Like someone receiving forgiveness. I knew I was breaking rules. There was no protocol for this kind of war story. The patient list existed for a reason, and he wasn't on it. Still, every night, when the others slept, or pretended to, I'd pass by cot 7 just to make sure his chest was still rising. That uneven breath became my new clock. When he coughed, I woke up. When he shivered, I fetched more blankets. When he cried, I told myself it was the rain tapping on the canvas. Because something about him called to me. It wasn't pity. It was something older, quieter, without a name. What I didn't expect was to start knowing him through his gestures. He traced shapes with his fingers along the edge of the bed. Circles, symbols, maybe maps. I'd answer with simple words scribbled on paper. Water, pain, family, safe. He never replied with words, but he gave me his eyes. and in them I saw my own absence, like I'd vanished from myself too, like we were both exiled on neutral ground, where touch healed more than language ever could. One night, while changing his bandage under the flicker of candlelight, I noticed a faint tattoo on his wrist. It wasn't military. It was a crooked anchor, probably done by an amateur's hand. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't just an enemy. He was a man ripped from youth, spat into a war he never chose. And maybe I was that too. A woman thrown into a battlefield not her own, trying to survive among codes, weapons, and silence. After that night, I started hiding his records. I crossed out numbers, forged entries, moved names around. No one noticed. No one questioned the thin nurse with sad eyes who took double shifts and barely ate. I was invisible enough to make it work. And maybe that's why the emotional story I lived with him never had witnesses. But don't think there was romance. Not then. Not yet. There was tenderness. A raw, fragile tenderness like fresh skin. There was a war greater than the war itself. The war of not surrendering to what your heart whispers when you're too tired to resist. Because everything forbidden feels more alive when the world around you is dying. And still, even in the face of fear, I kept going. I kept caring, protecting, listening. I kept inventing excuses for myself, saying it was just duty, just compassion. But the truth is that I was already falling. Not for his looks, not for his voice. I didn't even know what it sounded like. I was falling for the silence we shared, for the absence of questions, for the fullness of presence inside that absence. He wasn't on the list, but he was in me, and it was already too late to turn back. There are wounds the skin learns to hide, ones we cover with clean cloth, tight stitches, adhesive tape, and hope. But there are others that throb in places the eyes can't reach. I discovered that the first time I saw the scar running across his shoulder, drawn like a dry river cutting through flesh. It was deep, uneven, old. It didn't come from this war. It hadn't been made here. It was a mark that came before the camp, before the wet uniform, even before the silence between us. And it was right there, staring at that scar, that I understood. He didn't belong anywhere. For weeks I cared for August, like someone watering a flower in cracked earth. I learned to read him through subtleties, the way he turned his face at the sound of German commands, the tension in his shoulders whenever an American officer walked by, the obsessive way he looked after his feet, as if he needed to be ready to run at any moment. He carried a kind of ancestral unrest, like his very body existed at the edge of the world. And it was on that edge, in that in-between place where no one stays for long, that we found each other. The war story we were taught to tell was always made of sides, flags, rifles, and medals. But the real war, the one that seeps into fevered nights, into downcast eyes and trembling hands, is messier than that. It's drawn in doubt, in silent disobedience, in misplaced tenderness. And August was the embodiment of that doubt. He was the crack in a system that thrived on certainty. A man without a country, without a map, without a corner to call his own. A man someone had tried to erase, but who kept resisting just by breathing. That night, while changing his bandage, I realized he wasn't asleep. His eyes were half closed, but alert. I stared at that scar again, now under the flickering light of a candle, and felt a chill climb up my spine. It looked familiar. Not in shape or color, but in absence. It was the kind of wound you recognize because you carry it too, even if not on the body. I had my own invisible scars. The day I heard my father tell my mother he wished I were less weak. The day I was thrown out of a ballroom for dancing alone. The day I looked in the mirror and knew that no matter how right I did everything, I'd never be enough to be heard in a world that only listens to the strong. August never told me where that scar came from. But one day, with trembling fingers, he pulled from the inner pocket of his uniform a barely legible scrap of paper with a name and a German town scribbled on it. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a request. It was just a breadcrumb of origin. A reminder that, despite everything, he had come from somewhere. And in that quiet gesture, I understood. There was still a part of him that hoped to return, or be remembered, or be forgiven for surviving when so many didn't. I tucked that paper away in the infirmary drawer. No one else could see it. It was the first personal thing he ever entrusted to me. And maybe that's why I felt that, in that moment, I was carrying more than medicines and gauze. I was carrying an emotional story that couldn't be told aloud, because no one would understand, no one would forgive. After all, he wore the wrong uniform. And in that camp, that mattered more than any scar. Over time, I noticed how he shrank around the other patients. He never laughed, never spoke, never gestured too much. He was like a wild creature trying to pass as stone. He knew, and I knew too, that all it would take was one slip, one wrong word, one glance held too long, and it would all collapse. So every movement between us was measured, every touch calculated, every clean handkerchief left beside his cot was, in truth, a pact. The camp we were in was temporary. A dusty way station full of promises rarely kept. I already knew we'd be relocated soon, and that thought tore at me inside. Because with the new wave of nurses would come new eyes, new records. And August wouldn't survive another interrogation. He needed to disappear. But I didn't want to lose him. That was the knot. I, trained to save lives, now found myself trying to hide one. Not from death, but from the world. I remember a night when smoke took over the whole camp. A fire in the northern barracks set everyone into motion. I ran to put out flames, drag bodies, throw sand where there was no water. I came back exhausted, my cheeks scorched, my hands blackened. And when I reached the tent, I saw that cot 7 was empty. For a moment, I thought he had fled. And I swear, my heart leapt between relief and mourning. But then, from the dark corner of the infirmary, he stepped out, carrying a bucket of water. He had helped. He had fought the fire, too. He had stayed. In that moment, I knew he didn't want to escape. He wanted to be seen, even if only by me, even if only there. And maybe that hurt more than any absence, knowing that a man so invisible to the world still wanted to leave footprints in someone's heart. The war pressed on. The camp shifted. Names changed. But his scar remained, and it taught me, day after day, that belonging is a cruel illusion, because in the end we only belong to the memory of someone who dared to truly see us. And I saw him, with all his wounds, with all his silence. And he saw me too. The war story I lived with him was made of fragments, a glance on a grey morning, a spoonful of soup left at just the right corner of the bed, a note hidden in the pocket of my skirt, a candle that burned only for him. Every piece was a calling. Every night, a dive into a secret that bloomed like a forbidden garden inside me. And in the center of that garden, there was a scar. His. And mine, too. There was a stretch of the camp no one liked to cross at night. A gap between 2 medical units, where the canvas flapped in the wind, making sounds that resembled weeping. That's where the most delicate cases were kept. Amputations, deep infections, men on the edge of the end. Time moved differently there, like the universe itself had chosen to look away from that corner. That forgotten space became August's new station, when the number of wounded grew. No one protested. No one wanted that ward. No one except me. I volunteered to care for the isolated section. Told them I could handle the smells, that I wasn't afraid of silence. A lie. I just wanted to be near him. I wanted to keep our quiet rhythm alive. The dressing changes, the gaze that spoke more than any language, the discreet ritual of protecting what no one else could name. And he, as always, accepted, with a still body and wide-open eyes. He welcomed me with a kind of peace that clashed against all the chaos outside. That space, though filled with pain, was the only place I felt whole. The packed dirt floor cracked along the edges of the tent. Heat gathered there like the world was being slow-cooked in secret. There were no more lists. He was no longer August, the one without a name. Now he was simply him. And everything around shaped itself to his presence. The cot, the little cabinet where I hid stale bread and extra bandages, the rusted chair where I collapsed after my shift. All of it revolved around that quiet, dense presence made of absence. And still, so alive. The war didn't stop. Bombs fell closer. The death count rose. Eyes grew emptier. But there, in that endless field, I discovered something else. Some stories are only born when the world around them collapses. And ours was like that. A war story, yes, but told against the current. While everyone fought, we surrendered. While others hardened, we softened. While the world demanded certainty, we wandered into the maybe. One afternoon, I brought him a broken radio I'd found in a pile of debris. It didn't work, of course, but he smiled when he saw it. A small smile, like he'd forgotten his face, still knew how. I sat beside him and we pretended to listen to music, like we were from another time. Like the whole camp was just a dusty backyard, and we were kids with a new toy. It was absurd, and it was beautiful, and it was exactly the kind of secret no nurse should keep. But I kept it. That night I dreamed of my father. He told me everything, planted with lies, blossoms with guilt. I woke up sweating, breath caught in my throat. I went to August's tent. He was asleep, sheet clinging to his chest, forehead damp with a light fever. I stood there watching him breathe. So present, so real, so impossible, and still, so mine. The camp stretched beyond sight. No clear beginning, no clear end. Just tents, dust, screams, prayers, and more tents. And the two of us, a point outside the line, a wrong turn, a side story hidden between torn-out pages. It felt like being suspended between worlds, where everything was allowed because nothing would be remembered. The other nurses started noticing my absence in conversation circles. The doctors whispered about my silence. Eyes no longer looked through me. They watched me. Still, I kept going. I returned to his tent with the same care one brings to a sacred place. More and more certain that what we were living wasn't just a dream. It was resistance. A way to keep something human alive in a place where everything had turned to protocol. I knew he wouldn't last there much longer. Each day brought more eyes, more questions. Rumors swarmed like flies. That there was a foreigner among us. That a nurse wandered too much into restricted areas. That the Red Cross had no idea what happened behind the infirmary. And still, I refused to run. Because if war teaches anything, it's that whatever's precious dies too fast. And I wanted to stretch that impossible breath to its last second. One day I accidentally dropped a slip of paper with my name and a little drawing he'd made. A simple line connecting two circles, like planets, orbiting the same sun. When I noticed it on the floor, he'd already picked it up. And instead of hiding it, he smiled. A smile full of winter, a smile that said, "You belong to what has no name to." That's when I understood. He knew. He'd known all along that I had recognized him, that I was protecting him, that I was part of the same secret. And then, something shifted. I began writing a fake report by hand, a transfer plan, a document that might get him out. I knew it was no guarantee, but I had to try. Not for me. For him. Because an emotional story like this one, even if it could never be told, deserved at least a chance to keep being lived. The field then stopped being a place. It became a feeling. He was the field that had no end, the space between what we were trained to feel and what we actually felt, the place where love blooms disguised as care, and care as rebellion. And there, on that cracked ground, on that land forgotten by God and the headlines, I planted what would become my greatest mistake and my greatest truth, loving someone in the wrong uniform and not regretting it. Because in the end that was my real war story, not the one written with scalpels and reports, but the one traced with gestures, silences, and an altar of invisible candles. The field had no end. But neither did we. I never knew his real name. And as absurd as it may sound, that might have been the one thing that kept us both alive. There were no tags, no labels, no files. And if there were, they got lost along the way, dissolved in blood and sand. He never told me who he was, and I never dared to ask. The camp we lived in was fenced off not just by barbed wire, but by an invisible code that separated what was allowed from what was felt. Saying his name would have been crossing that sharp wire with bare skin, and names, in that world, carried the weight of a sentence. His uniform didn't need translating. I already knew it belonged to another army, one we were programmed to hate, one that had taken lives I myself had tried and failed to save. And yet, there was something in his presence that undid me. He didn't carry the stiff posture of soldiers convinced of their glory. He had the look of someone who had lost everything and still woke up anyway. That look, the same one I've seen in women giving birth alone in hospitals. The look of someone who's survived their own identity. He called to me with his eyes, with small gestures, and once, just once, with a whisper. It wasn't a name. It sounded like Opal, broken, swallowed, shaped by fear and tenderness. A cracked sound caught between the throat and the heart. It was the closest we ever got to naming what was happening between us. A timid calling made in the dark. I wanted to respond with his name. I wanted to return him to existence with a single word. But it was impossible. And somehow, sacred that it stayed that way. In that war story, where everything was a statistic, where the dead were just numbers on paper and the living were reduced to roles, anonymity was our only shot at eternity. We didn't know how to call each other, but we knew how to find each other. In the way he reached out when I approached, in the way I always left a clean cloth near his head, in the water glass at hand, even when the camp was rationing. It was all so small, but in those tiny offerings was everything that kept us standing. Once I dropped my clipboard. It held names and diagnoses for over 20 soldiers. A regular nurse would have rushed to pick it up. But I froze. Because among all those names, his wasn't there. And that hurt in a new way. Like by protecting him, I had also erased him. Like in my effort to save him, I had sentenced him to be forgotten. I knelt down, gathering papers with trembling hands, while he watched me from the back of the tent. And when I returned to the bed, he gently touched my wrist, as if to say, I know. Slowly we created our own language, a language of gestures. He traced little shapes with his finger on the wooden bed frame. A circle meant calm. A triangle meant pain. A straight line was safe. I responded in kind. It was like we had returned to the childhood of all languages, back when the world was still named through feeling. And maybe that's why his pain felt so much like mine. Because without names, everything said felt truer, purer, more tragic. One day I overheard 2 nurses whispering behind the tents. They said there was a strange man who never speaks. Said the skinny night nurse protects him too much. I felt a chill run up my spine. The secret was leaking. I knew it wouldn't last much longer. But instead of pulling away, I did the opposite. I brought him a dried flower, one that grew outside between the rocks, and placed it beside his cot. He stared at it for minutes. Then, with a delicate motion, tucked it inside one of his boots, as if it were the only piece of beauty he'd ever been given. Was that love? I don't know. Maybe it was something older than love, something that came before desire, that needed no touch or promises, something that simply happened, that bloomed in the middle of ruin like a rose among shrapnel. We couldn't say names, but we knew what we were to each other. We recognized each other from the inside, beneath the layers the war had forced on us. At night, I wrote letters I never sent. One of them began, "If I knew your name, maybe I'd know how to forget you." I kept them in an old biscuit tin under my bed, along with an antique Red Cross pin and a scrap of lace from the dress my mother wore at my sister's christening. It was my reliquary of loss and tenderness. And there, hidden from the world, my emotional story took form. The war continued. With it came transfers, deaths, restructurings. The higher-ups arrived. The sharp-eyed began sniffing out deviations. I knew they were watching me. I knew one wrong move could cost everything. Not just for me, but for him. So more and more our silence became a shield. More and more we hid inside a world that belonged only to us. We couldn't say names, but we left each other clues, like the day he sketched a line of mountains and a star on a piece of paper. And I knew it was a childhood memory, or the day I whistled an old southern melody in the air and saw tears fill his eyes. We didn't need common language anymore. We had built our own, one that can only exist between 2 souls, forbidden to love each other. The cruelest part of my war story wasn't the blood. It wasn't the deaths. It was the impossibility of naming what was real. It was the weight of having lived something so deep, so full, and not being able to call it by its name. Because sometimes, when love is born in the wrong place, it must stay hidden. And what is hidden either dies or grows like a root-breaking stone from the inside. And me? I let it grow, even without a name, even without breath, even knowing that someday I might not get to see him again. And that's why I still speak of him this way, in fragments, in pieces, in whispers, because his name I never had, but the love, that I carry whole. Behind the camp, there was an old shed no one used anymore. It had been built long before the Red Cross ever set foot there, maybe by traders or some forgotten regiment. But now it was nothing more than a heap of warped boards, invaded by sand and heat. It reeked of rotting wood and old leather, and no one wanted to go near it. The soldiers said it was cursed, that someone had died there, and that it was better left to the shadows. But I saw a kind of miracle in that place, a pause between what was real and what was imagined. And that's where I took August for the first time, barely conscious, trembling, supported by my arms. That was where our silent world stopped hiding between bandages and became something else. That morning a patrol from another regiment came through the camp. There was an inspection. Men who didn't know me. Men who could recognize his uniform, his face, even his silence. I couldn't take the risk. He was no longer safe in the remote wing. He needed to vanish. But not entirely. I needed him close. I needed to hear him breathe. I needed that gaze that reminded me beauty still existed, even in the middle of such ruin. So I led him, slowly, through maps and linens, into that dying cabin where time no longer cared to move. 3 days, 3 full days I hid August there. I brought food when I could, water in canteens, makeshift dressings, cloths soaked in crushed mint. My heart beat like a drum with every corner I turned. Me, a nurse sworn to rules, had become an accomplice to something that had no name and no pardon. And yet, I never hesitated, because when the world screams too loud, sometimes the only thing that saves us is a whisper. And August, he was my whisper. The cabin was dark, stifling. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in thin lines, drawing accidental altars across the floor. On one wall was a crooked nail, and I hung a white handkerchief there. My sign to him. I'll be back soon. In the corner, I laid down old military blankets. He slept curled there, knees drawn to his chest. Sometimes he trembled. Sometimes he murmured words in another language, half prayers or childhood apologies. I sat beside him without speaking, just watching, and in every silence, there was something stronger than words. Those were days of suspended reality. The war still roared outside, gunfire, bombs, shouted orders. But inside the cabin, time slipped by slowly, like warm honey. I lost track of the hours, forgot about the pain in my legs, about the exhaustion. It was as if everything before, and everything that would come after, had been barred from entering. We existed only in that crumbling present, like 2 candles flickering in a desert. And the strangest, or perhaps most beautiful thing is that it was there, in that forgotten corner, that he began to speak, softly with broken words, blending English with other languages. He said, mud, cold, mutter, snow, pointed to the ceiling and said, freedom, then placed his hand on his chest. It was like he was piecing himself together with what little remained. And I listened. I didn't correct him, didn't interrupt. I just let him speak. Because more than understanding, I wanted him to feel heard. In one of those moments, he drew 2 parallel lines on the dirt floor with a piece of burnt charcoal. One longer, one shorter. Then he blew the dust away and looked at me. I understood. It was about him and his brother. One who stayed, one who went. A life separated by force. A war story that didn't end on the battlefield, but kept dragging inside the chest. I touched his shoulder gently and closed my eyes. I had a sister, too. One who never came back, trapped in a marriage that devoured her. War takes many forms, darling. Sometimes it's made of gunpowder. Other times it's made of absence. That night he gave me something. A metal button, pulled from his old uniform. He offered it with both hands like he was giving me his heart. I held it like I was holding fate. A piece of him was now mine. And in that small gesture I realized I loved him. Not like in books, not like in films. I loved him the way you love a flower that grows through concrete, with fear, with awe, with gratitude. Our secret now had a body. It smelled of sweat and damp wood. It sounded like staggered breathing. It tasted like stale bread broken in 2. It wasn't just an emotion. It was a place, a time, a pact. And that cabin, that ignored ruin, became our temple. But time. Oh, time is a traitor. It always comes back, always collects. And on the 3rd day, a sergeant saw me returning with the white handkerchief in hand. He looked sideways at me, asked where I'd been. I smiled and said, I went to gather herbs for fever, and kept walking. But I felt it. He knew. Something in me had changed. My walk now carried the weight of someone who loves in silence, That night, I knew I had to bring August back. The cabin was no longer safe. The camp was closing in. And inside me, something cracked. I didn't want to let him go. But I knew I couldn't keep him there forever. Our refuge had been a miracle, and every miracle must end. On our last morning in the cabin, before the sun rose, he gripped my hand tightly, like someone trying to etch a gesture into memory, like someone who knows that moment will never return. I leaned my forehead against his, as if our heads could stitch together what the war had torn. And in that breath between two heartbeats, I made a promise. You're getting out of here. I'll get you out. It wasn't just a promise, it was a vow. A nurse's vow, a woman's vow, a soul's vow. And even if the world collapsed afterward, in that moment, time stood still and let us simply be. Just be. I wrote the letter on the 4th day. The night was strangely clear, against all odds. The African sky, cloudless, left the stars bare like exposed nerves. I sat on a wooden bench behind the nursing tent, where no one usually passed, and on a grimy notepad, I wrote something I might never have the courage to read out loud. My body ached, my feet burned, but it was my soul that throbbed, not from fear, not from guilt. It was longing for something that wasn't even over yet. As if my heart already knew that everything we had built in that forgotten cabin, between cloth and shared breath, was hanging by a thread. The letter began with the word, if, and that said everything. If it were another time, if it were another place, if our names didn't carry borders, if my eyes could say what my mouth had kept silent, if my duty as a nurse didn't demand I save only bodies, not bonds, if I could choose who to protect, even if it cost me everything. It was a parade of what-ifs, of promises that would never become action, of stripped-down truths, a confession of someone who loves through trenches. I wrote it for him, but also for myself, because keeping it all inside was like hiding a bonfire beneath the skin. It burned me up, dried me out from within. It was more than a secret. It was a seed of life planted in the soil of loss. And if I didn't write it, I feared I'd forget that any of it had truly happened. Because war has this terrible power. It can make even love feel like hallucination. Auguste. Yes, I used the name I made up for him. There's an entire world between our shoulders. Mine full of invisible burdens. Yours marked by a scar that haunts even my dreams. I saved you, but not in the way they think. I saved you because I saw something in you no one else did. And you saved me too. From dryness, from habit, from obedience. You gave me back my touch. The touch of a woman, of a soul, of someone who sees life where others see threat. The words spilled like tears that no longer care who's watching. I wrote about the first time his eyes locked onto mine. The heat that bloomed in my chest like the desert had caught fire inside me. The fear of being found out. The tenderness that never asked permission. How the soldiers started avoiding me because they noticed my absence during normal hours. How I learned to walk lighter, more invisibly. All for him. All for me. But the hardest part to write was the ending. If I had spoken your name out loud, it would have stopped being just mine. It would have become a weapon in the wrong hands. A sentence, or worse, a message to send you back. I didn't want that. I couldn't. I didn't dare. Forgive me. Forgive me for loving you more in silence than in action. For hiding you even when my heart screamed to show you to the world. You were my forbidden flower, my hidden altar. And maybe because of that, you loved me back. I closed the letter with fingers dirty from dust. There was no envelope. I folded it into 4 tiny pieces, so small it felt like a dried petal. I tucked it inside my left boot, between the insole and the sole. where only I knew. And it stayed there, for days, for weeks, for decades. I never gave it to him. Not because I didn't have the chance, but because giving it would have meant breaking the last thread between protection and exposure. And there was something sacred in choosing silence, in loving without a name, in keeping that piece of our story just for myself, like hiding a jewel in a pocket sewn inside a dress. An emotional story doesn't always have to be shared to be real. Sometimes what keeps it alive is the very fact that it's a secret. In the days that followed, I looked at him differently, as if every gesture was a hidden goodbye. I touched his hands more gently, changed his damp cloths more slowly, as if in that slowness I could stretch time. And he noticed. He looked deeper into me. His eyes said more, said things I still can't translate, but still hear whenever the night is too quiet. The letter, well, it became a kind of prayer. I recited it silently every time gunfire came too close, every time a new wave of wounded arrived, and I had to pretend I was just another pair of hands. Every time I saw faces falling apart and had to steady myself like someone trained not to shake. I returned to those words and held on to them. They were my shelter, my wall, my breath among the rubble of reality. Because in that war story, where everything was noise, the letter was my space of silence, where I could still be whole, where I could still remember that even in hell, there had been a moment of paradise, even without a name, even without witnesses. Today that letter is kept in a little black box inside a locked drawer. I open it from time to time, read it slowly. And I never change a single word. Because of all the things I've written in my life, that was the most honest. The only one I didn't write with the world's eyes. But with a bare heart. August never read it. But maybe he didn't have to. Maybe he already knew. Because some loves aren't built on words, but on gestures, on presence, on a quiet bond that doesn't need explaining. We recognized each other. We protected each other. And even if it was brief, or maybe because of that, that was my real war story. And that letter I never sent, is living proof of it. I always knew it was only a matter of time. I did. No sliver of tenderness survives long under a structure designed to crush everything soft. But even though reason whispered that warning to me every morning, nothing prepared me for the day I entered the tent. And cot 7 was empty. Just like that. No commotion, no explanation, no trace. It was as if he had evaporated into the dry desert air, as if he had unraveled inside me, leaving only the echo of what could have been. The sheet was still rumpled, like he'd woken before sunrise and hadn't had time to fold it. The metal cup still had a trace of water, and the white handkerchief, the same one I'd used as our signal at the cabin, hung loose from a nail. Everything said he had been there, that he'd awakened. But he hadn't arranged the departure himself. Of that, I was sure. August would never have left the bed in such disarray. He respected neatness the way others respect sacred ground. The first thing I felt was the blood draining from my fingers. Then, the air thickened. My breath grew short. My legs gave out. I stumbled out of the tent like someone searching for her own name in the middle of smoke. I went to the records office, asked about transfers, emergency evacuations. They said a convoy had passed through before dawn, taking the most critical patients. But there hadn't been time to catalog all the names. It happens, they said. It's war. Common, they said. It cut through me like a dull knife, because he wasn't common. He was mine. He was part of me. And seeing him ripped away like just another nameless body undid me. For the first time since I'd set foot on that foreign soil, I broke. I locked myself in the supply room, sat on the cold stone floor, and cried until my face burned. It wasn't just loss. It was fury, a kind of silent revolt, as if the universe had spit back the only thing that had kept me alive among so many dead. I searched for days, asked questions carefully, scoured through reports, transfer lists, footnotes. Nothing. No trace, no similar names, no lid. It was as if he had never existed, as if my entire war story with him had been some fever-drenched hallucination. But I knew it wasn't. I knew because the handkerchief still held his scent, because the letter remained tucked between the insole and sole of my boot, because the button from his uniform, the one he had given me in silence, was still sewn into the inside of my apron, where no one could see. There was a moment when I thought he might be dead, that someone had found out and silenced him, that his body lay in some mass grave, denied a name. War does that to men who don't belong anywhere. But something in me resisted that thought. A deep intuition, drawn from the same well that mothers know, that gives you goosebumps without wind. He wasn't dead. I could feel it. He had vanished, but hadn't gone completely. That intuition kept me upright, kept my hands steady even as my heart splintered. Because now, there was a larger mission. I was the keeper of a secret only I knew. The last link between him and the world. Routine returned, but I was no longer the same. I moved slower, avoided eyes. The other nurses' laughter felt far away, like a language I'd forgotten. The camp kept growing, bringing in waves of new soldiers. But for me, everything had shrunk. I was moving through a locked room, where every wall echoed the face I no longer saw. One night I dreamed of him. He stood alone in the middle of the camp, under an orange sky, eyes fixed on mine. He didn't speak, but he reached out his hands. When I came closer, he placed something in my palms, a perfectly folded dry leaf. I woke up with clenched fists, as if I were still holding the dream. I went to my box of letters and for the first time, reread the one I never sent. Every word felt carved into my body, not written on paper. The following week, a shipment of personal items arrived at our station. Things found scattered in the fields, wallets, crucifixes, notebooks, broken necklaces, and among them, a torn scrap of paper, sketched with what looked like two mountains joined by a river. It was the same drawing he'd made in the cabin, the night before, falling asleep, without a sound. My hands trembled. The paper was stained with what looked like dry mud and had a fold in the top left corner, just the way he always folded things. No name, no date. But I didn't need either. I placed it with the letter, sewed both into the lining of my coat, right over my heart, and there they stayed. Like an extension of my pulse, his absence became my new companion. I had become a nurse of ghosts. I saved men while the one who saved me remained missing, and every new face was a reminder that my favorite one was no longer there. But hear me, darling. Disappearing is not the same as dying, and sometimes love born in absence is the kind that grows the most. That was the cruelest part of my war story, learning to walk with a hollow space that was somehow full of meaning, of memories no one else knew. An emotional story that can only be told in fragments, in symbols, in silences. He disappeared, but he left marks, like invisible ink that only shows when you warm the paper with a flame. And that's what I still do. I light a candle, close my eyes, and he returns. For a moment, for a breath, and maybe that's all I'll ever need. Decades later, back on American soil, at a time when my hands had begun to fail, and my memory sometimes hid behind patches of fog, I was asked to help catalog old Red Cross archives. It was more a kindness than a duty. They knew my mind still remembered names, dates, patterns. And they also knew that despite the years, I had never stopped being a nurse. That was what was left of me, a calling that etched itself through time like a tattoo on the soul. I accepted the invitation like someone opening the door to a dusty cellar, unsure of what might be found inside. It was an old building in Baton Rouge, stifling even in winter, with narrow corridors lined with boxes, drawers, and faded labels. The documents there seemed forgotten by memory itself, but something in that silence comforted me, as if, within those dusty walls, someone was still whispering that my war story hadn't been completely swept under the world's rug. It was on the third day that I found the box. No name, no catalog number, just a smudged label. Unknown, 1943 to 1945. I opened it carefully, like handling ancient bones. Inside, pieces of life, necklaces, pocketbooks, black and white photographs, faces without names, smiles erased by time. And among them, one image stopped me. It wasn't clear. Blurred in the bottom corner, water damaged in spots. But it was him. Or what was left of him. It was a photo taken from behind, in a sandy field, with a truck in the background, and long shadows cast by the sun across the ground. The man in the image wore the uniform I could recognize, even with my eyes closed. There was no face, but there was posture, and there, tied to his wrist, was the white handkerchief. And that, darling, only I knew. Only him. Only me. Our secret. I sat right there on the floor, holding the photo like a sacred relic, my throat closed, my vision blurred. And everything around me disappeared. For a moment, I was back in that endless camp, in the cabin where time stood still, in the tent where names couldn't be spoken. It was him, without a face, but with presence, with proof, with memory. It was confirmation that it all had been real. Until then, I had lived with doubt tucked deep inside me. The doubt that maybe it had all been imagination. That heat, fear, fever, and love had swirled together until I'd invented an emotional story just to survive the loneliness. But that photo, even incomplete, washed the doubt away. It was like the universe returning something it had once stolen. A piece of a puzzle that only I had ever known how to put together. I took a plain envelope and wrote on the back, "Kept by Opal Nadine Rivers, so it won't be forgotten." And I kept it. Today it sits in a small frame above my candle-lit altar. Yes, the one in the living room, between the heavy curtains and the scent of incense. It's not a typical frame. It's made of dark wood, with frosted glass. Like the photo itself asked not to be too exposed. And I look at it every day, without needing to see a face. Because in time you learn, love doesn't live in the eyes, but in the details. Some have said keeping a photo from behind is useless, like trying to remember someone by the echo of their voice. But I knew that in that blurry rectangle there was more of my life than in any family album. Because he was my choice, a silent choice, a dangerous choice, a true choice. And you see, my dear, keeping that photo wasn't just about memory. It was resistance, because the world we live in, the one that spits out its heroes and forgets its missing, rarely allows for stories like mine. Stories that defy sides, that break rules, that are born from the rubble of obedience. But this was my war story. And that photo was the altar where I placed, day after day, what was left of what couldn't go on. Some days I sit with it in my hands, run my fingers along the outline of his body, trying to remember the feel of his skin, the curve of his shoulder, the smell of earth and salt that clung to him. And sometimes, truly, I feel like he's looking back at me. Like, even without a face, He knows I'm still here, that I still keep him, that I still love him. People have asked me if I ever had children. I say no. But I had him. I had a man I loved between trenches, whom I hid beneath bandages, whom I protected with my soul. I had an emotional story that doesn't need a military record to be real, because what we lived lives in me, and that faceless photo, it's our truest portrait. I kept other things with it. The letter I never sent, the button from his uniform, a piece of the white handkerchief, all tucked inside a small chest at the foot of my bed. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I open it like playing an old song, one only I know how to sing, one without a chorus, without applause, but still echoing, here inside me. Because this is the truth, my dear. Some loves don't need a happy ending. They just need remembering. They just need not to be forgotten. They just need an altar, a corner of the soul where they can rest. And that photo, this faceless image, this nameless presence, is all I have left of him, and all I need to know that I was loved, and that I loved. Every night, before turning out the lights and lying down, I light a candle. Not out of faith, not out of habit. I light it like an invocation, like calling back a presence the world keeps trying to erase. It's a small candle, white and plain, but I carry with me the belief that, as long as that flame flickers before my dark wooden altar, something in me stays whole. Something still exists. Something still loves. My altar isn't adorned like those in churches. There's no cross, no saintly image, just a button from a uniform sewn onto a linen ribbon, a letter folded 4 times and wrapped in a strip of lace, a blurred photo pinned with a rusted needle, and above it all, silence. A thick, old, nearly sacred silence, because everything I've kept there was never said aloud, never explained, and never needed to be. This house once echoed with other sounds, piano keys, laughter from friends, visits from family. But now, what you hear most is the creaking of old wood and the hiss of a kettle. I don't welcome many people, not out of bitterness, but because some things aren't meant to be shared. This part of me, this war story stitched with forbidden love, it's mine, all mine. Like the black dress I wear when the ache tightens. Like the lace gloves that hide my wrinkled hands. Hands that have held bodies and secrets and still know how to tremble. Sometimes I imagine what life would have been if he'd stayed. If the cot hadn't been empty that day. If someone had simply said, "Yes, he's here. He's safe." But thoughts like that don't heal. They only erode. So I return to the candle, to the altar, and I let memory follow its path, with no shortcuts. In the flame, I see reflections no one else sees. The cabin where time stood still, the field that had no end, the scar on his shoulder, the white handkerchief hanging like a silent prayer. His eyes locked in mine as if that was the only place on earth where a truce could exist. I don't know how love found a way to bloom there, between gauze and rubble. But it did. It grew like weeds through ruins, like a stubborn flower in the asphalt. And that's why the altar exists. Because I couldn't let him die a second time. There are no funerals for silent loves, no caskets for feelings that were never claimed. And so, I built my own mourning. This altar, this flame, this memory protected from the eyes of the world. Every day the flame dances a little differently, sometimes stronger, sometimes faint, and every time it flickers I feel as if he's answering, as if he's saying he's still here, that I'm still his, even after all this time. Loneliness, my dear, isn't the absence of people. It's the constant presence of something no one else can see. And my loneliness has a name, or rather, the absence of one, because the man I loved saved, hid, and protected, never had a name in this world, only in my mouth, only in my soul, only in the altar I light every night. People sometimes ask why I never married. I smile and say, life didn't leave me time. But the truth is, I gave everything I had to someone who could never give anything back, and still, I never regretted it. Because what we had was true. It was deep. It was eternally ours. Even if the world never acknowledges it. Even if no official record ever proves it. Even if I don't know his full name. That was my greatest emotional story. And it's enough for me. The candle's flame lights what no electric bulb ever could. The things only visible to eyes that have lost much. To skin that's healed too many times. To a chest that learned how to beat alone. I don't know how much longer I'll have the strength to light this candle. But I know that, as long as I can, I will. With both hands. Because it's what anchors me. It's what reminds me who I was, and who I loved. He was my secret, and now he's my prayer, my resistance, my most vivid memory. And if tomorrow, for any reason, I'm no longer here, if this house goes completely silent, if no one ever walks past these heavy curtains again, he'll still live, because someone, somewhere, will find that photo, that letter, that button, and maybe, just maybe, they'll understand that even in war, even in the shadows, someone loved, deeply, quietly, eternally. Because some wars don't end in gunfire. They end with candles lit, with eyes closed, with old sighs, and with altars that only a woman like me would know how to build. Time has taught me not every ending makes a sound. Some closures arrive like a soft wind that snuffs out a candle already tired of burning. And maybe that's how my story needs to be heard. Like someone listening to the breeze slipping through the cracks of an old window. Not in a rush, not with judgment, but with a heart open enough to receive what was never said aloud. The truth is, my dear, the greatest war I carried wasn't made of blood or trenches. It was made of silence. A silence full of names I never dared speak, of looks more intimate than any words, of gestures so gentle no one else noticed. But I remember them. Every one. I was a nurse to men who left without saying goodbye, to soldiers who cried like children in my arms, to voices that whispered, "Don't forget me," when time had already run out. But with him, I never needed words. What we lived was stitched in the in-betweens, sewn between urgencies, planted where no one thought anything could grow. And today, in this old house suspended in time, with its heavy curtains, altar of candles, and the scent of incense in the air, I still light my little flame, not out of nostalgia, but out of gratitude. Because despite everything, the war, the disappearance, the namelessness, I lived an emotional story, one that no one else saw, but that was whole, one that maybe you, on the other side of the screen, understand in the quiet of your own life, if you too carry someone without a name, if you too love in secret, if there's an altar inside you that no one knows about, then you're not alone. I see you. I understand you. Leave your presence here, in the comments, in your heart. Share this story with someone who also needs to remember that love outlives time, that tenderness is stronger than absence, that the flame burning inside us still dances, even after all this time. And if you want to stay with me, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this. More candles lit in nights of silence. More secrets waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And may your war, too, find peace.